welcome from Washington, D.C., and our best regards from the Africa Center to all our alumni, colleagues, and partners from over 60 countries we have registered for today's program, the space domain and Africa's security landscape. My name is Dr. Nate Allen. I am the Africa Center's faculty lead on cyber and emerging technology issues. Before we continue with our program, I'd like to briefly turn things over to the Dean of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, Dr. Ashish Malakiash, to say a few words. Dean, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Allen. Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and for your interest in this very important program. As Dr. Allen mentioned, my name is Dr. Ashish Malakiash. I'm the Dean of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Many of you may know the Africa Center, but let me reintroduce our institution to those of you who may not be very familiar with it. This year, we are marking our 25th anniversary. The Africa Center was established by our Congress in 1999 for the study of security issues relating to Africa and serving as a forum for research, communication, and exchange of ideas. To achieve this mandate, we have developed our mission statement to advance African security by expanding understanding, providing a trusted platform for dialogue, building enduring partnerships, and catalyzing strategic solutions. We are organized around 3 pillars to execute our mission. First, academic affairs organizes seminars, workshops, and events just like this one. Second, research and strategic communications. If you are not familiar with our website, I strongly encourage you to check it out and use it as a resource. We have publications in French, Portuguese, and other languages, as well as spotlights and infographics. Third, community and alumni affairs. Building and sustaining these enduring partnerships I spoke of in our mission statement is very important. I am pleased that we have so many ACSS alumni joining us today. Our alumni network is the true strength of the Africa Center. Our relationship with you keeps us relevant and focused on the security issues that are most important to Africans. I am very pleased we are able to offer this webinar today. There's much discussion and recognition of the links between space and Africa's security landscape. Thank you again for sharing your time with us today, and I look forward to productive and a very informative webinar. Back to you, Dr. Allen.
Thank you very, very much for that introduction, Dr. Malakiash. There are a couple of numbers I want you to take away from this webinar. The first number is 100, which is the number of kilometers above the Earth's surface where the space domain begins. For some of you that may be joining us today, this may seem a little bit too remote to figure much into how you confront the threats, which are mostly based on Earth, like criminal networks or insurgent groups. But if there's one thing I hope that you take away from today's webinar, it's that Africa's security challenges do increasingly have an important and growing stakes in this domain far above the Earth's surface. Second number, $30,000. That is how much it cost the US space shuttle to launch 1 kilogram of payload into outer space a little over a decade ago. Now, that cost is approximately $1,500 and will be approximately $500 when SpaceX's Starship enters into service very soon. This represents a 60-fold decrease in just a little over a decade. Third and final number, 17. That is the number of African countries that have already launched satellites into outer space, a number due to these rapid decreasing costs that is likely to grow very, very rapidly. While the majority of these launches are for commercial purposes, space's growing national security implications are one reason African countries are becoming more engaged in the space domain. This is not widely known, but the information and communication technology infrastructure in Africa and elsewhere is already quite dependent on GPS systems and space-based communications networks, and may soon be completely disrupted by satellite-based internet service providers who are coming into competition with terrestrial stalwarts like MTN, Orange, etc. Some African countries already possess space-based intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and disaster management capabilities. And again, we are likely to see these capabilities proliferate in the future. Finally, as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, small satellites in low Earth orbit are becoming vital providers of connectivity and secure military communication, which is one reason why we're seeing the rapid proliferation of SpaceX's Starlink and potentially soon other competitors. In short, while the effects of the space domain on African security outcomes might not be visible, space is already playing an important role in Africa's security landscape, and it is one that is likely to grow in years to come. And to help us unpack these security implications, I'm truly delighted to be joined by three deeply distinguished panelists we have here with us today. First, we have Mr. Temidayo Oniusun. I'm going to talk generally about their experience. You should have access to their bios on our website. Mr. Oniusun is the founder and managing director of Space in Africa, which is the leading market intelligence firm shaping the future of the African space and satellite industry. Mr. Oniusun's contributions to the space sector have earned him recognition as a 2020 Carmen Fellow and a 2021 Forbes Africa 30 Under 30 honoree. His expertise is frequently sought out by major media outlets, and you may have heard him on BBC, CNN, Forbes Africa, Voice of America, and CNBC, among others, where he frequently provides space-based commentary and analysis. Second, we have with us Dr. Zolana Zhao. He is the inaugural manager of Angola's National Space Program Management Office. In this capacity, Dr. Zhao has overseen the launch of 2 Angolan satellites, ANGOSAT 1 and 2, and was instrumental in designing Angola's space strategy. Previously, Dr. Zhao was the director of the Angolan Institute of Communications. Finally, we have joining with us Brigadier General Hilary Kipkose, who is also a distinguished Africa Center for Strategic Studies alumni. He has been serving since 2021 as the Director General of the Kenyan Space Agency. He has 30 years of service with the Kenyan Air Force, including as the Kenyan Defense Attaché here in Washington, D.C. Under his leadership, the Kenyan Space Agency hosted its first conference and expo in 2022 and joined the growing group of African spacefaring nations by launching its first satellite. So we're absolutely delighted to have the three of you with us here today. And to start with, we're gonna ask a question to you, Mr. Oniusun. You are among the leading experts covering the space industry and space domain in Africa. And you have, over the period of, I think, more than a decade now, carefully tracked Africa's growing participation in outer space affairs and the growing importance of the space domain for Africa. So to some of those who may be a little bit skeptical that have joined us today, why do you think space ought to matter from a national security perspective? And why is space domain awareness important for African security sector leaders and professionals?
Thank you very much, Dr. Nate. Space is critical to national security for African countries in a way that extends far beyond traditional defense operations. In an interconnected world where technology is rapidly advancing, space assets have become foundational for both security infrastructure and broader societal resilience. For African countries, space holds immense potential to address unique security challenges while also supporting sustainable development and economic growth. To start with, space technologies like satellites are essential for a variety of security and defense applications. They provide real-time capabilities for communication, surveillance, navigation, and early warning system, which are critical to coordinating and executing effective security operations. In regions with vast land masses, porous borders, or even areas that are hard to reach, satellites enable real-time surveillance and data collection, supporting border monitoring, anti-terrorism efforts, and even counter-piracy operations. Beyond defense, space technology has an equally important role in disaster response and climate resilience. Africa faces a disproportionate impact from climate-related events, such as droughts, floods, wildfires, which can destabilize communities and strain resources, leading to national security concerns. Earth observation satellites provide data necessary to monitor these environmental threats, enabling early warnings and quicker response times to natural disaster. While space programs in Africa today are mostly focused on socioeconomic benefits and sustainable development, the role of space technologies in maintaining national security cannot be overemphasized. Satellite data, both the ones that are freely available from providers like US SUNSAT program or even the European Commission Copernicus program, they've played critical roles in addressing security issues around environment and disaster management and monitoring in Africa. The role of secured communication in national security has also prompted countries like Angola, Egypt, Nigeria, and Algeria to acquire national communication satellite infrastructures. And more importantly, countries like Nigeria have gone ahead to even establish national defense space agencies in order to ensure internal security through the use of satellites, ensure the peaceful use of space through counter-space operation, while encompassing, surveillance, navigation, protection, and space intelligence analysis. In addition, these infrastructures also provide satellite-based weather, earth observation, communication, and intelligence to their security operatives. However, there is a critical geopolitical component of Africa's use of space technologies for national security. First, while African countries have launched 60 satellites up to date, most of these technologies were manufactured by foreign companies. And therefore, the reliance of African countries on China, Russia, Europe, or even the United States on the development of its critical infrastructures that are meant to aid national security often raise sovereignty concerns. The war in Ukraine, especially also the way the West reacted to it, has also led to several occurrences in the space sector that have made countries to begin to prioritize technology and data sovereignty. While in the past, many countries were okay with data and technology acquisition, some are now pursuing self-reliance. Secondly, while freely available data and even commercial grade data could be quite useful in tackling national security-related issues for many countries. Restrictions around access to many of these technologies and even high-resolution data, or specific type of data such as synthetic aperture radar data, often limit how African countries are able to leverage space technologies to address their national security challenges. And these often provide opportunities to build or expand an existing relationship with foreign allies and partners. For example, if the West would not sell this data or technologies to them, they are often compelled to go to whoever will sell it to them. And this and many other challenges are now shaping the dynamics of geopolitics in the African space sector today. Lastly, turning to space domain awareness, this term which refers to the ability to detect, track, and understand objects and events in space, whether they're satellites, debris, or even unidentified objects. For African countries, space domain awareness is now an emerging priority. With the emergence of the African Space Agency and as many more African countries build and launch satellites into space, space domain awareness is now critical to safeguard these assets. And space domain awareness also strengthens Africa's sovereignty and strategic independence. And this is also shaping geopolitical competition. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very, very much, Timodayo. That was a really excellent sweeping overview, I think, of the main uses, challenges, security interests that African governments increasingly have in space. So now let's bring in some of these countries themselves. I'd like to go to Dr. Zhao next to give us a sense of what Angola is doing and how it views some of the issues identified by Mr. Oniusun. The current Angolan space strategy from 2016 to 2025, for example, identifies surveillance, disaster management, and border security as ways in which space observation contributes to Angolan defense and security. Can you tell us a bit about what progress has been made in addressing these issues under this current strategy? And maybe give us some ideas about how you see these considerations evolving or changing in the next space strategy, which I imagine is going to be due pretty soon. Dr. Zhao, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. It's a pleasure to be here. My greetings. I'm standing to the Dean Assis Malakias, Dr. Assis Malakias, and my big African brothers, Temidayo and Brigadier Hillary, who has been an amazing job pushing the Space African agenda, and all people listening to this webinar. So no, that is a great question. And Dr. Allen, let me just lay it out to say that I think Temidayo touched two critical things, right? That I just speak from his introduction. One is the communication challenge that Africa has today, and the high resolution satellite imagery, right? And as you know, Dr. Allen, this is key for security. You cannot do an intel with a medium and low resolution satellite imagery. However, if you look at the continent, Temidayo just updated us that we have launched 60 satellites, but none of them are high resolution satellite imageries, right? We are fully dependent on foreign countries to provide us high resolution satellite imagery, which is critical. It means that our space programs are not really being built to really support our security actions in the continent when it comes to Earth observation, right? So you laid out very well. In our space strategy, we identified that we had to look very carefully how we build our space program, and we focus in two directions. One is communication. As you know, Dr. Allen, only over 16% of Africans are really on the internet, which is crazy. Means that more than 600 million Africans out there, they don't know what we're talking about. And whatever we're discussing today, they won't be having access to this information. Now, if we tie in with the security aspect, it's even much worse. So what our space strategy has done successfully, after a decade, we successfully launched 2 communication satellites. The first one, AfSA-1, we had an orbit failure in 2017. Very good lessons learned, and we successfully launched the first of its kind owned by an African government, an high throughput satellite, which has been in orbit in 2022. As we speak, more than 400,000 Angolans and some of them Africans are being connected through the internet. Right? If you can imagine, Alan, just to stop there, emphasize that. Can you believe that most of African countries, as we speak today, they are fully dependent on foreign communication satellites, especially for rural areas, right? Even if you're deploying for other missions, which doesn't make sense. So meaning out of 55 countries, only 4 countries estimate that say they have their own communication satellite. The Angola is proud to be one of them. The second issue, as you mentioned as well, as our strategy, we did differently. Most of African countries decide to build small satellites in Earth observation as part of the 60s. However, as I mentioned before, none of them are high resolution. What we did, we partnered with our allies, and we have full access on high resolution satellite imagery. That is easier, so much easier to support some of operation, not just in security, economic aspect as well. Because when it comes to border control, disaster management, as I said before, only a very high temporal resolution, a special resolution can give you the answer, right? Because timely and precise information, in this case that I mentioned, is key. If we look to the future of our space strategy, how we see, we just acquired a brand new satellite from Earth observation, Angel-1. We just procured a new one, if I can ratify, and we'll be building very soon, and will be one of the first of its kind in Africa. Why are we pursuing that for an space strategy? Because we want to continue with our vision that the Angolan government is trying to do, which is to be one of co-leading countries, especially in Africa. And with this new satellite, we're going to be able to map more than 100,000 satellite imagery almost weekly, so that we'll be able to map very precisely different key sectors of the Angola and Africa as all. I'll stop here for now. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Zhao. That was excellent. I'm not a space expert. I focus a little bit more on cyber issues, but I see some parallel concerns that I often hear from African governments and security sector officials about a little bit of a desire, not only for greater capabilities, but also a little bit more control over how those capabilities are being used. General Kipkose, let's go to you. I know that, like your counterpart in Angola, Kenya is focused on harnessing the strategic potential of space to address some of its national security challenges. At the launch of the Kenyan Space Agency's 2023 to 2027 strategic plan, the role that space is playing in supporting national security agencies through situational awareness, disaster management, and environmental monitoring were all highlighted. So could you elaborate a little bit more about how space is becoming an increasingly crucial element in Kenyan national security, and how the strategic plan from 2023 to 2027 is being implemented to address some of these concerns?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you, Dean Dr. Malakias, Dr. Allen, and the SUSS faculty for the invitation to participate in this webinar on a very pertinent topic. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share some of my perspectives on the topic. I'm also happy to meet my colleagues and brothers, Temidayo and Dr. Joao, on this platform. So let me begin by pointing out that the main object of Kenya's National Space Program is to enable or facilitate national socioeconomic development and to enhance national security. And our approach seeks to be rather holistic in nurturing the growth of the sector. And we are looking at beyond just the development of the infrastructure to include even nurturing the startups ecosystem in our country. So we seek to develop capabilities on utilization of Earth observation in various sectors, including agriculture and food security, natural resources management, land and physical planning, blue economy, environmental monitoring, disaster management, climate change monitoring and mitigation, among others. And now coming to the specific question, in the interest of time, we have a number of interventions aimed at developing or enhancing capabilities to support national security, as you have already rightly pointed out, around situational awareness, disaster management, and environmental monitoring, among others. And in terms of the specifics, on the issue of the situational awareness, we have large and policed areas along our borders with our neighbors in the troubled North of Africa region, as well as challenges in monitoring activities in our EEZ in the Indian Ocean. And this includes monitoring illegal fishing or even contraband and drugs smuggling. And we are working to be able to deal with this. We are working on the establishment of a geoimagery intelligence center that gives us near real-time surveillance and monitoring of activities across our borders and at sea through a change detection algorithm and processing capabilities. And the system will be able to ingest data from multiple sensors, including optical satellites and SAR, that is synthetic aperture radars, among others. On the issue of disaster management, we also use Earth observation data for disaster management. And for us here in Kenya, fortunately or unfortunately, one of the major natural disasters is flooding. And we have cyclic pattern of droughts and flooding. And to be able to deal with specifically flooding, we use high resolution imagery to direct emergency response efforts and use of the Earth observation data to develop flood hazard mappings as a way of early warning to communities in flood hazard prone areas. On the issue of environmental monitoring, we also use Earth observation data to assess impact of phenomena and inform timely interventions on such activities like habitat destruction, monitoring trends of urbanization, monitoring natural resources such as forests for destruction or encroachment, monitoring water towers and water catchment areas, and monitoring trends in land use, land cover, mapping, and so forth. So that, in short, is how we utilize Earth observation to support national security on those specific items that you've mentioned. And this is a focus in our strategic plan for the upcoming short-term period of the next 3 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Kibkose. So kind of two themes I'm hearing are that it seems that space-based imagery, like synthetic aperture radar, high resolution imagery, is really, really crucial to help African countries get a real-time sense of what's going on in their border regions, especially helpful if, like many African governments, there are relatively low density areas that are really, really helpful to have something like high resolution imagery be able to use for intelligence gathering and intelligence purposes. But also, and I think a key theme here that I get from what you just said, General Kibkose, is the importance really of human security, right? And using satellite imagery or satellite analysis or satellite-based sensors to understand things like land use, agricultural resources, water usage, what's going on in the maritime sector or maritime domain. So, we talk a lot here about human security, and it seems to me one huge, really, really important area where space has a lot of potential is just helping African countries get a much better sense of how the environment is shaping the security landscape in their countries. So I think all three of you have done a really excellent job of establishing why space is growing importance and why kind of space-based technologies are becoming increasingly useful from a security perspective for the African region. There is clearly a lot of strategic benefit they bring. And I'd like to now shift gears a bit and talk a little bit more about some of the risks of humanity's growing dependence on space, as well as partnership opportunities. And since we ended with you, General Kapkosa, I'd like to start with you and bring you back in. And again, we'll do one more round of questions, then go to Q&A. So in your view, to what extent does Kenya's ability to use and maybe defend its space-based assets, the more that it has up there, and leverage the space's broader strategic potential, depend on both international cooperation and capacity building? What kinds of capacity building needs and potential partnership opportunities would you like to see? Do you see a need for Kenya, but also maybe for other African governments in a similar position over the next 5 or 10 years?
Thank you. The question that you ask, of course, speaks to the ability to be able to defend space-based assets. That's an aspiration, obviously, that is still a long way off the mark right now in terms of building those specific capabilities. And for now, because we are basically nurturing the growth of the sector and building capabilities, there's a lot that we rely on international cooperation because it is very key in developing the necessary space capabilities. Kenya is developing and emerging spacefaring nation, and we seek to develop national space capabilities, as I said, to support national socioeconomic development and of course enhance national security. But we also are focusing, as I mentioned, at efforts to nurture what is still currently a nascent space industry and space economy. So space technologies and space-enabled technologies have become so ubiquitous. We literally depend on them for our well-being here on Earth. And definitely, of course, as you rightly pointed, we have that great dependence on space. But because space is hard and complex, and no nation on Earth, and perhaps maybe with the exception of the US, is able to develop all the space capabilities it needs on its own, because of obviously the capital outlay for development of systems is also quite significant. So there is need of development of human capacity, human and technical capacity. And that is where international cooperation really offers us opportunities. So we seek viable partnerships on a win-win basis. We do not seek commercial off-the-shelf solutions and products. Just that alone. We also would like to develop our own capabilities too. And that means pursuing partnerships that we believe would deliver credible capacity building. So tied to these partnerships is really the need to also develop our own capacity. So what kinds of these partnership opportunities do we need? I think is examining and on various aspects. Development of systems is one. Development of capabilities along data processing and analytics is another. Or the whole array of space systems engineering, development of infrastructure, and that whether that be the data infrastructure, space systems engineering, ground segment, and that kind of thing. I said also because we are looking at developing a more holistic, in a more holistic approach, even support to the startups ecosystem that is important for growing that domestic space industry and space sector is also an area that we see potential for opportunities, and also opportunities around policy and legal frameworks, partnerships in instituting a sound policy, legal and regulatory framework that makes the environment conducive and attractive for foreign investment, and also partnerships in building capacity along quality assurance. So potential partnership opportunities would include access to data. For us right now, we are principally relying on or focusing on Earth observation as a key entry point, because we see there's a lot that we can deliver in terms of buying, even for government and the wider public, if they're able to see the connection between space and socioeconomic activities like agriculture, human security kind of issues. Of course, partnerships in sharing of infrastructure, opportunities for satellite as a service. We have discussions with our partners in the region, ground station as a service. And also there are even opportunities on space situational awareness, just to be able to understand the space environment better, so that even as we craft knowledge around technologies, we are also more, we also understand the environment that these systems are going to end up in. So that in a nutshell is what I think and consider to be important in terms of partnerships. Thank you.
No, thank you very, very much. And I like particularly that you mentioned the importance of legal and regulatory capacity building as well as human capacity building. I think all too often in conversations about technology, there's an assumption that if you just transfer a particular technology, say high resolution satellite imagery or synthetic aperture radar, that implies there is a capability to analyze and use it. When I think some of the biggest deficits that many African countries face, no matter what the technology is often more from a regulatory and human capital perspective than from an actual technological perspective. So for all those in the audience thinking about doing capacity building, don't forget the importance of education, training, the human element, and thinking about how to foster sound legal and regulatory frameworks.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Dr. Zhao, let's bring you in. I'd like to ask you a similar question, but maybe given that you've been representing Angola and Africa in the space industry for quite a while, what about what Brigadier General Kipkokise said resonated with you? To what extent are Africa's space-based assets dependent and likely to remain dependent on international cooperation and capacity building? And what kinds of capacity building and partnership opportunity needs do you see?
Yes, thank you, Alan. And this is a great question. I think our General Hillary really laid down some of our core root problems what we have in terms of not just the space assets, the challenges we still have to be able to cooperate efficiently, right? Let's talk about protecting the space assets. So let's understand that the satellites, all the space assets are there in the orbit, either LEO, MEO, GEO, right? This is more or less what the satellites in Africa, they're around. So we don't have any deep space operation yet that I'm familiar from Africa. So we are almost in these three orbits. So unfortunately, we don't have any capabilities, as General said very well. And today we are being very, very focused and engaged with the emerging developed countries on space traffic management discussions. Because what happened, Dr. Allen, right now is we are at the rising speed of the number of satellites getting in orbit, right? We're getting in Africa as well, more and more countries and entities launching satellite. But unfortunately, we are on dark out there. We don't have any capabilities whatsoever of know what's going on with our assets in space. So what we've been trying to increase right now is to work with some countries who has these capabilities to share this experience so that we can learn how to protect these space assets. A lot has been done already in terms of COPOS, UNOSA discussions, and as well as some of our biggest satellite operators in the continents as well. We've been sharing experience on how to detect and how to protect some of these space assets. It's still a long way to go, right? And the only way that we can do that more efficiently, and we're going to start doing more pragmatic and smart partnerships. And I'll explain what does it mean? Dr. Allen, if you see ESA, NASA, the biggest agencies out there who has been doing tremendous in space, their budget is sometimes 1,000 more of what we have per agencies in the continent. One of the big issues is really funding, right? And without funding, you cannot build proper space infrastructure. Doesn't matter what is the political will, what is the technical will, you won't get there because you don't have the fund to do that, right? Where the new space, which is the concept that we see today, and you laid out very well, this is what SpaceX is trying to do, lower the cost of launches through the private sector. I believe we might have a very good opportunity for Africa right now. I believe we have to increase attracting foreign direct investments in the space sector in the continent. I really don't believe as an African government we'll be able to have the funds to keep up with the major players in the space arena. The only way we'll be able to accelerate that is if we invite the private sector to come in Africa and have a more efficient partnerships to help us build the infrastructure. So if I just break down very quick for the sake of time, when you talk about the space sector, we have three main sectors. We talk the upstream, we're talking about launches. We are not there yet. It will take a while. The midstream, where we operate on satellite. Now we have more in African countries operating on satellite, and then the downstream for services. Each one of these segments, there is a huge opportunities for the private-public partnerships, right? And to help us to push our space programs and agenda. Now, the capacity building piece, that is the key, Dr. Allen. All the things you mentioned about regulations, policies, you name it, and all these sectors, we are lacking behind badly in terms of skills and expertise. I normally say, with this example, try to close with this example. Dr. Allen, if you are not a civil engineer, I'll give you $1 billion. It will take 10 years or 20 years. You're going to build me a bridge, right? But if you are civil engineers, well-trained, I can give you maybe just $10 million, and you're going to do this in 3 or 2 years of time frame. So the challenges that I see today in Africa is that we don't have the expertise to absorb even the investments, even the funding and the opportunities out there. And lastly is we have to talk the same language. We have to train at equal levels, because otherwise what happens in the hands when we go to negotiate to have public partnerships or to work with other developed nations, we're going to be buying apples instead of bananas. That was my takeaway. Thank you, Dr. Allen.
Thank you very, very much. There was a lot, I think, of really interesting analysis there. Like, I think, you know, on the one hand, it's clear that I like to say we live in an age of technological accessibility, where we're seeing the commercialization of many different types of technologies reshape the global order in various ways. It seems to me that the space domain is still sort of in the relatively early days of sort of this age of accessibility. And because of that, I think that makes some of the capacity building needs you mentioned all the more important. Like, it's one thing to be able to kind of access or use, you know, spend a couple $1,000s on a commercial satellite. But given how much it takes to train somebody to be able to effectively use that information, the need for infrastructure, I think the point I take away from that is the capacity building needs are still quite immense. So for those of you that might have questions, I would encourage you to begin to ask them, because we will go to Q&A soon. But I'd like to go to Timodayo first, who will give the final word to. I think, you know, both of our panelists talked, I think, very eloquently about their capacity needs. Dr. Zhao mentioned sort of the growing dependence of humanity on space, and particularly the interdependence, I think, between the fact that you have basically a few spacefaring nations and commercial entities who are managing a lot of space-based assets, which means that I think at least the foreseeable future, most countries are going to be dependent upon one another to ensure the peaceful their access to space and to ensure kind of that they're able to use it for whatever purposes they need to, which I think means that it's in everyone's interest that the outer space domain remains relatively peaceful, even as it does have increasingly a national security dimension to it. So, Timotao, can you talk a little bit about what steps you think African governments can do to both secure their national security interests while ensuring that space remains peaceful so that they can also continue to use it for their economic development interests, and so that they can kind of maybe avoid what could be some really the pernicious effects of increasing conflict or non-peaceful uses of outer space. Timothy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nate. Let me start by saying that the growth that Africa has experienced in the last 2 decades with respect to space program development is actually largely thanks to international cooperation. So whether it's in terms of access to technology, access to data, capacity development, or even infrastructure development, international cooperation has been very critical in this. But it's important to note that this has been achieved through, what you can call non-aligned diplomacy, where, African countries have been very open to working with everybody and anybody over the last couple of years. So whether it's in, acquiring technology from China or cooperating with Russia, or launching some of their payloads from the US, they've been working with everybody. They've not been taking sides generally. And I think that, as we look at the future where, African countries look to secure their national security interest, this non-aligned diplomacy is very critical. Aside from this, I think there are a couple of steps that I think some of the countries need to also take. Number one is in establishing clear national space policy. So while more than 20 African countries today have some sort of space program, many of them actually do not have a guiding policy, and a comprehensive space policy is very foundational, as it aligns the vision, emphasizing peaceful exploration, sovereignty, and security. Another is in developing space domain awareness capabilities. So we already have some African countries like Angola and Egypt that are already engaging, in some space domain awareness, global initiatives, especially at the UN level. I think we need more of this. I think in previous years when conversations around space domain awareness come up, you rarely find African countries, but I think that it's high time that they come into a lot of this conversation. The other thing is in fostering more of regional and international partnership, especially agreements that can also help provide access to shared infrastructure, data, expertise, and, more largely strengthening diplomatic ties that reinforce Africa's commitment to peaceful use of space. Then it's also important to commit to space debris management and sustainability. Even though when you look at how many payloads have been launched globally, what African countries are launching is very tiny. Over the last 20-something years, just about 60 payload. That's very tiny when you look at what everyone else is launching, but it's also important for African countries to join international initiatives to track and mitigate debris and contribute to long-term space sustainability. Establishing some of these practices early on would also demonstrate Africa's dedication to the safe and peaceful use of space. It's also important to advance diplomatic efforts for space governance, whether it's in active participation at UN COPUS or global engaging in global conversations that aligns with Africa's peaceful aspiration. This is very critical, and this can be done, of course, at individual country levels and also through the newly established African Space Agency. Public-private partnership is also critical. And lastly, I would say that African countries should adopt a dual-use approach for space technologies, where space technologies can serve both civilian and security applications. As Earth observation satellites are used to monitor environmental changes for agricultural planning, they can also be used to provide valuable data for border security and disaster response. A problem we have in Africa today is that the security conversation is in a way far away from the space conversation. And, oftentimes the space agencies, they don't have security mandates. So this creates some sort of bridge, but I think that countries need to come up with better policies that ensure that they can actually leverage on space technology for dual use. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Excellent. And so with that, let's turn things to Q&A. I encourage you as participants to please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to begin to submit your written questions for the panelists. You may submit your question in any language that you like. If you would like me to, if you'd like me to recognize you when I ask the question, please state your name in the question. Otherwise, I'll keep you anonymous. And as moderator, I'm going to convey to as many questions to the panelists as my time will allow. Although we already see quite a number of questions. So let's get started. I'll ask 3 at a time or so. Ask our panelists to intervene in any order that they like, and we'll keep going until for another 30, 35 minutes. So, one really interesting question, and this comes from Lieutenant Colonel Kofi Poku from Ghana, who is an ACSS alumni, is, he mentioned that not a lot of African countries have been successful in launching satellites into space. I think the 2 countries here notwithstanding. So in countries that have been successful in launching satellites, how were these industries or strategies developed? I think what were these satellites built locally or built by foreign nations, right? So to what extent are African dependents, even those that are launching satellites, dependent on non-African technology? So I think another kind of related question that a number of things we've had asked is that we're obviously seeing increased strategic competition in the space domain. Concerns about potentially the weaponization of space, threatening space-based assets, increasing use of space for ISR-related purposes. So I think a general question is, given the importance, as all of you have mentioned, of ensuring that outer space remains peaceful, what role do the panelists see that African nations ought to have in kind of navigating this climate? And then kind of a final question from Akan Badwin at the UN Development Program. A little bit more elaboration on how African nations are using or may use space-based technology to specifically enhance border security, to combat threats like trafficking, smuggling, and terrorism. I think just a little bit more kind of granular detail, I think would be helpful. So let's start with you, Dr. Zhao, because you're the only panelist we haven't started with a round of questions, and then we'll go to Timodayo and conclude on Brigadier General Kipgose. So Dr. Zhao, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Allen. I will try to go through very quickly to these 3 kind of questions to see if I can just get to the core for the sake of time. So yeah, why we are not having a lot of African countries being successful launching satellites is because, as I mentioned, the part of the space sector where I say the upstream, where you need to have a launch capabilities for decades ago, even just make the parallel in US, you have very few hand of companies who can launch satellites. Imagine with all this type of investment, it would be very impossible for Africa to be able to do that, to launch that satellite. We have more now companies that are able to build these satellites, but they're still struggling to get that end that qualifies satellite to be launched. So the only way I believe that can be done or can accelerate is to do what Brazil has done, for instance. That is a typical example. They build manufacturing launch capabilities with foreign countries. When I say Brazil, I'm just giving an example. I can give Japan and other countries as well. So meaning that we as Africans, we have to make sure that, this is what I mentioned before, a very strong public-private partnership that can give us more launch capabilities to put the satellites in orbit. However, going back to my discussion is the type of personnel that you need really, and here maybe something I missed. There are satellites and there are satellites. This is important, right? What do I mean by that? I mean, and Temidayo knows I like to pick point in this one, which is most of countries that have launched satellites, they weigh 10 to 50 kilos, right? Meaning that those satellites are more used for demo in terms of technology. The lifespan is very short. There's very little they can do as a mission, especially for military purposes. However, when you increase complexity, size of the satellite and the mission, let's say you're going to over 500 kilos, something like that, that changes a lot. That really limits the country. It's not by accident that I mentioned that only 4 African countries have geocommunication satellites. Each of one of these satellites are 2 tons satellites. They are huge, right? The engineering challenges, the geopolitical procurement, other things, so much complex. That's why very few countries are struggling to do that. The level of expertise and the partnership you need to put the satellites in orbit is totally different in the game. So going in terms of the role in competition, since the Cold War, right, space has been about competition, and this never changed. The only thing we have today is that now Africa is becoming very attractable on the geopolitical game, right? We know what is going on between US, Russia, China to still position themselves in Africa as well. And in space, gonna real dictate who's gonna lead Africa. That is a fact, right? So meaning that African countries are gonna really play a role on how those things move forward. What do I mean by that? Because in terms of exploring resources, safety, security, you name it, right? You need a space technology to do that efficiently. So means that now with the African Space Agency coming up, we're very excited. I think Africa is better organized to play this role for peaceful purposes, even on Earth with space technology when it comes to diplomacy and other things. And lastly is, so how can we enhance border control? Very good question, right? This is something we're doing a lot of research. There is something called a concept. This is very technical, tipping queuing, something with a very high resolution. You can detect objects. That's why I say it's important to have high resolution satellite imagery. When I mean high resolution satellite imagery, let's say you have a pixel that is 15 centimeters in size, right? Or 30 centimeters. It's mean you can see a point A and B in that dimension, right? And if you use AI and you automate the process, you can detect even a boot of a person passing to a border to another, right? This is just a typical example if you have to go down. So due to the sake of time, I will stop here for now. If you guys need more engagement through NATE to the African Center Space Studies, we can support. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Timidayo, let's bring you in.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nate. Let's see, where do I start from? There's a couple of questions that I wanted to address. Let me start with, there's the question about partnership and cooperation, how African space agenda avoid being overwhelmed by this conflict. So I already talked a little about this. The way African countries work, the way they work today is where they work with everybody and they work with anyone. So you even have countries like South Africa that host infrastructures for both the US and Russia. You've got countries that are partnering with pretty much all the major superpowers. So this has never been an issue in the broader sense. And I think that this is one of the things that African countries got very right at the beginning of their space program, where they're not taking side. If they want to acquire technology, they go to whoever is willing to sell the technology for them. If they want to acquire data, it's the same thing. So I don't think there has been any conflict in this area. I think this question also ties very well to the question about how African countries can attract foreign investment, whether private or not, to commit to expansive African space program. So what you see today, the geopolitics of African space program is in such a way that I'm going to use the US and China as example. So in the last decade, China has been, doing a lot of work in Africa, cooperating on so many levels. And, in this last decade also, the US hasn't, or let me say in the last 2 decades, the US hasn't done much with African countries. And so because of the rising interest of China in Africa, now you've got the US trying to do more stuff with Africa. And this just summarizes what the geopolitical landscape look like. African space program is growing. We're talking of about $20 billion worth of economic revenue every year. In the last 20 years, African countries have spent close to $8 billion to acquire satellites and to build space infrastructure. So, beyond the security issue, there is a great economic value, in the African space industry. And I think that a lot of the global superpowers, they're interested in this. And because of that, you see countries trying to outdo themselves when it comes to relating with African countries. And I think largely this has been very beneficial to African countries because with this current landscape, they can get the best of the US, they can get the best of China, they can get the best of Europe. And all of the partners also understand that Africa working with the US, for example, does not mean they wouldn't work with China or with Russia or with Europe. So this is the landscape. This has not really impacted, investments negatively. I would say that it has impacted investments positively. Moving on to the other question about development of regional space policy by ECOWAS. So ECOWAS does not have a regional space policy. ECOWAS is currently working on a regional head observation satellite, but this program is still at a very, very early phase. But they're not working on any space policy. There is also the question about, 55 African countries, only 4 have been able to put satellites in orbit. This is not true. I think about 16, 17 countries have launched at least 1 satellite. And the total of this make up about 60 satellites. In terms of how these technologies have been built, majority of these satellites were outsourced to foreign companies. For example, French companies they've gotten well over $2.5 billion worth of satellite contracts from Africa. Other countries like China, close to like $1 billion. I think US companies have probably gotten about $250 million worth of satellite contracts from Africa. So majority of these satellites are outsourced. Majority are built through joint collaborative efforts that include some sort of technology transfer and capacity development program. In terms of, let's see, majority of these were also built outside of Africa, many from Europe, China, a few from Russia, and we, talking about the collective space agency, we already have the collective space agency now. The African Space Agency is now operational, and that is based in Cairo. And the essence of the agency is also so that all these countries can come together, cooperate, and pursue similar agenda. I think these are most of the questions. If there's anything else I'm missing, you can let me know.
No, I think we're still on the three questions about strategic competition, terrorism, and border security, which I actually don't think has been addressed. So, General Kipkose, if you want to come in and feel free to address any of the three questions, but I think specifically kind of the question our colleague had about specifically how Kenya or other African countries is thinking about using space-based assets to address border security challenges, that'd be great. General Kipkose, you're muted.
Yeah, my colleagues have, I hope you can hear me now. So my colleagues have spoken well about most of the questions, but I'll speak specifically to the question that you raised about border security. I alluded to it in what we seek to do in terms of monitoring activities across the border and, our monitoring activities also in our EEZ. I spoke to establishment of a geoimagery intelligence center, which is supposed to ingest data from a mix of sensors, both optical and SAR data, and using AI being able to detect changes. Of course, this would have to be high resolution imagery, being able to detect changes that are happening at sea and characterizing what would be suspicious events, whether at sea or across borders. So the technology is there. It is possible. It only requires that you have a higher, in terms of the resolution, whether it is the temporal resolution, so that you have constant coverage. The repetition rate should be high enough to allow some kind of a monitoring and to be able to detect activities that are happening across border. That is where the challenge is, to be able to have satellite data that are refreshed almost on a regular basis every couple of hours is really where the challenge is, and it would require a lot of huge investment or subscription to satellite operators who already have a number of satellites in a constellation. So those are the thoughts that we have. We already having discussions just to be able to realize that capability because of the problem that I mentioned of the security challenges in our part of Africa, where those cross-border security threats are very real and face us on a daily basis. On a broader scale, in terms of our approaches, I think the context and the priorities tend to be a bit different. There are countries that would consider priorities in satellite communications, and that could potentially be explaining why we only have 4 African countries that have launched or operate geo communication satellites. In Kenya, we think that the focus will be more on Earth observation because we see the opportunities and the challenges that face us in socioeconomics and what we think would be better solutions derived from Earth observation capabilities. We did launch a satellite last year. It was a small satellite. I know Joao talks of satellites, and there are also satellites. And the reason and the approach is very simple, in my opinion. So, yes, it is possible to go into a procurement system and acquire a 2-ton satellite. It is very feasible, but we felt that the level at which we are in as Kenya, and in terms of the pace at which we wanted to grow, whether in space systems engineering, but also more importantly, on the downstream exploitation of that data. So you can have a 2-ton satellite, Earth observation satellite up there, but you don't have the capacity or basically the capacity to fully exploit the data that you acquire from there. So we felt that these need to go in tandem. Even as you build capacity on space systems engineering, which requires that you have, the critical mass that needs to be well trained, that needs to be able to design and to develop, a small satellite. You still need the infrastructure to be able to do, the simulation and the actual manufacturing of that, to do the assembly, the integration and testing. So there's quite a lot in terms of the requisite infrastructure and the capacity that needs to be in place to be able to develop the systems, integrally as African. So in our approach, we had a team of our own engineers who were involved in the design, but they had to go through some capacity building with a partner in Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, and so in terms of the design, that was basically done by our team, but the actual simulations, the actual manufacturing was done by our partner. The actual assembly, integration, and testing was done by our partner, as a way of getting our engineers to get the experience in what is entailed in terms of space systems engineering. And it was also important that we start small, so that our engineers also learn how to not only develop a satellite, but what it entails in terms of, once it is up there, in terms of space operations, how do you establish communications? How do you track that satellite? How do you, task it to be able to do certain jobs? How do you do the ground segment operations? How do you then process that data? Because that is really important. So there's a whole lot of considerations in terms of capacity building that really requires to be done in a progressive way. And so the approaches are different, the contexts are different. There are countries that would focus on Earth observation, others would focus on other types of satellites for purposes of their own meeting their national requirements. What was the other question? I think,
General, I think
yes.
that's good. Yeah, we have. I'd
Yeah.
like to get in one more round of questions. We have about 15
Yes.
minutes left, so
Okay.
it's a good time to kind of
Okay.
get in those. I think one of the things you emphasize in various ways is how, in talking about how African countries are navigating growing strategic competition, I think it's similar to how they're doing it in other domains of technology, realizing that they're not necessarily going to choose sides. And I think particularly through entities like the AU and ECOWAS and other international institutions, there's not an insignificant amount of ability to set common policy positions. Even if African countries are generally not at the leading edge of the technology, I do think we can, and there is a possibility for leadership on the policy, regulatory, and kind of international cooperation side. And indeed, I think we're seeing African nations play a greater role there on all kinds of technology issues. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what we also see and continue to see in the space domain. So on that, there are, I think, three kind of questions I'd like to maybe end with. We had a couple of different comments about the importance of regional strategies or the role of regional institutions. And I think particularly about maybe that was one question about whether you alluded to this a little bit, Temidayo, in your response. How possible or feasible could it be for ECOWAS or the AU to actually launch their own satellite, right? And what kind of uses might that satellite have? What kinds of concerns does international or regional cooperation especially when it comes to the owning of space-based infrastructure and assets have, especially when we're talking about it from a national security perspective. Kind of a second related question, right, that is asked is about how Africans can attract foreign investment into their space sector. I think you mentioned, Temidayo, that there's already been $8 billion that has been invested. It seems that there is a lot of interest in this industry, even though there are relatively high financial costs. So maybe if you can talk a little bit more about what African countries are doing to attract investment, whether it's private or not, and for those who are interested, what they maybe can do to attract more investment despite the expense of conducting space programs. And then kind of, I think the final question, and I think General Kipkose, you actually talked about this very eloquently, but how should African countries who are thinking about becoming spacefaring nations go about building the expertise that they need to grow and manage the space-based infrastructure they have? I thought we actually, General Kipkose's discussion of Kenya starting small with one satellite, using that as a means to sort of train their engineers, might be one model. I'm curious what other approaches, maybe Angola, or what you see across the rest of the continent, Temidayo and Dr. Zhao. So regional strategies, getting investment, and building expertise were the three final questions. General Kipkose, why don't we start with you and answer any of those three questions that you would like.
So, in terms of attracting foreign investment, I think it is very important that there is a system that creates a conducive environment for investment. Obviously, that calls for a very sound or robust institutional, policy, legal, and regulatory framework that really protects, foreign investment and is also attractive. There is need, of course, for ensuring that an enabling infrastructure is in place, whether it be ICT infrastructure, whether it be, power infrastructure and the like. So I think those are critical, and of course, at a fairly well-educated population, youthful population, I think those would be very good, attractions for foreign direct investment, and of course, climate, a political climate that is, stable. I think those are very, very critical ingredients for attracting foreign investment. But very importantly, how do you then protect the intellectual properties and those technologies that are going? So a sound IP protection system of regime must also be in place. I think those are just some of the things that spring to mind when it comes to attracting foreign investment. How do you build the expertise? Yes, in my opinion, I think it is important to of course, having a strategic plan is very important. But how do you grow those, capabilities over time in terms of not just looking at acquisition of a system, but also looking at the utilization of the technology, holistic look in terms of not just the acquisition, but the actualization, the maintenance aspect of it, and the like. Those are just some of the thoughts that spring to mind when it comes to this particular two topics.
Thank you. Temidayo, let's go to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nate. So let me answer the question around investments and all of that. I think one of the biggest problems that African space program face today is that majority of the government institutions and government agencies they want to do everything by themselves. So if you look at the global space industry, the private sector is like at the cost center of that. They're innovating, they're building product and services that can then serve the government institutions. But in Africa, this private sector is largely missing, where and then you see that the agencies want to do everything themselves. And if you have an industry where the government institutions are like the leading entity, it'll be very difficult for you to be able to bring investment into that, because at the end of the day, you expect the government to invest in that, and the government are not willing to do that. So this limits innovation and market investment. In the last decade, startups in the African space industry have raised about $200 million, and majority of this money is from foreign investors. So there is money, but I would say that the landscape needs to change in a way that it can actually attract a lot of foreign investment. Africa's annual space budget today is around $500 million, which is pretty low. But in order to go from $500 million annual budget to where you can have billions of investment from both African investors and foreign investors, you need to shift from the government being at the center of things to the private sector innovating and building products and services that it can then sell to the government. Talking about regional institutions, I think that we also have a major problem here where African countries actually really cooperate with each other. In fact, one of the studies that we did, we found that of all the cooperative agreements that were signed by African space agencies over the last 20 years or more, only 15% of these were signed between African countries. So basically, African countries are signing more agreements with foreign partners and foreign institutions, and they really cooperate with each other. And this is one of the reasons why initiatives like the African Space Agency is very strategic and important, because through this you can get countries to actually work with each other, reduce redundancy. Because when we talk about everybody's trying to build satellites and all of that, but you can Angola has a communication satellite, Morocco has an Earth observation satellite. These countries can share the data and resources with other neighboring countries. But that is not happening because and this is also because of the issues with cooperation at African, among African countries. And we hope that the African Space Agency would, address some of this problem. African Space Agency in the near future, it's possible that they will run their own satellite infrastructures that would provide coverage over Africa, probably share data amongst African countries. But even more than that, they would also be looking at how they can integrate existing infrastructure and run a data sharing policy so that we can actually reduce duplications and redundancy in the industry.
Thank you. Dr. Zhao, final word goes to you.
Dr. Allen, thank you so much to give me final words. And once again, this is, I didn't even see time passing, impressive, because Timidayo in general, Hilary, these brothers, we like what we do every day and to change the continent when it comes to space. And I'll start with the regional issue. This is key, right? And everybody in the audience can see that this is the approach that countries have been doing this for a while. They are doing with ESA and some other things. So I think in Africa, we're starting to look at this way. I'll just give an example. As we speak today, Angola is sharing an initiative that the ministers of ICT from SADC, 14 countries in Southern Africa, decided to build their own satellite, their own regional communication satellites. Because the idea that they said, hey, what makes sense, each one of us, Angola has done it, and then say, why South Africa will do the same? Why Botswana? Then they gave the mandate. We have been sharing this since 2019 on designing a strategy, policy, and then a program to come up with the SADC communication satellite. That is an example. Another example of regional initiatives, we're talking about the African Space Agency, right? The African Space Agency today under the policy is saying, we don't want to see duplications. We want to see groups. We went to IC in Milan right now, and when we met with the Italian Space Agency, the idea we said in the meeting, we said, hey, Italians have been working with Kenya, has been working with Egypt, very successful. Why are you duplicating this? We are giving Kenya and Egypt to lead us and then share with others models. I think, Nate, the discussions about more regional approach of things, I think now is taking off. So when it comes to how we can attract investors, Dr. Allen always said this, doesn't matter if you are Elon Musk, if you don't have the political support, there is none you can be done, right? To attract foreign direct investment, the political arena, a level needs to be on the forefront, really to show all the investors that your country has what it takes for the investor to come to the. I'll give an example. Angola 5 years ago was a country that really US was not looking into it, right? Our presidency took in power. We have seen the most high profile US delegates coming to Angola. By the way, we are waiting for the President Biden visit coming in the first week of December. What happened is our president decided really to go out there and go after knocking doors to the different countries who are really superpowers in this world, say, hey, we are here in Angola. These are the facilities. I think the rest comes. Sometimes the other way around can be tricky, right? Because what happens a lot, there is a bottom-up approach, but this bottom-up approach, sometimes it gets hindered in some of the processes. I think our politicians need to be on the forefront. I think Kenya has been doing this great for years, and I think Angola is setting an example as well. That's why I say it's not by accident that President Biden decided to visit Angola out of 55 countries, right? So about how to show how free becomes. There was a third question that I'm trying to see if I got it right. Is about the I don't know if you can remind me, Dr. Allen, the last one.
Building the expertise.
Yeah,
Sorry?
building expertise.
Building expertise. Yeah, that is great. And I think I'll link with the one want to close with what Temidai was saying about the private sector. When NASA and other biggest space agencies they started, it was the government pushing, right? And they've poured billions of dollars in the market so that the private sector would arise, right? So in Africa, we are challenged because we don't have the same way. We have a different context, right? Temidai is right. We have seen more private sectors, but normally, really, I'm very pragmatic, guys. So normally, what we have as private sector, a lot of in Africa, they are really enthusiasts. They are not companies, right? So meaning that if we really want to build a private sector, once again, as I said, we need to invite biggest investors from outside to come and partner with governments that will derive these small PPPs to grow the private sectors in Africa. This is what I see. This is how I see. And with the new space economy that is booming right now, I think we have a chance. And that I agree with Temidayo. Now we see more companies being very interested to invest in space in Africa, which they have the flow laid down. We just need people that come with technology and knowledge. So in terms of expertise, to finalize, I keep on saying, Alan, is sometimes you think you know, but you don't know, right? And I get this every day. Dr. Allen, we have done this in Angola from zero. 10 years ago, we didn't know what was a space. When we started doing a space program strategy, we thought we knew what we were doing. The only way we learn how to do it is really, we went to set with the best. We sat with the Russians, we sat with the US, we sat with the French. We went on the industry where they are building one of the highest tech technologies, how they do the launches, how do the design, how do the construction, right? I was myself 1 year in one of AIT facility because I was pushing things that was not possible. After 6 months, I realized, oh my God, I didn't know what I'm doing. Meaning what? we as Africans must learn first. Be humble to learn that we don't know, go there to learn who knows, and then we're going to be able to push our space program. That will be my final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. And that concludes our webinar. A few key takeaways. Timidayo says he has to go. That's totally fine. We are at time. For those of you that are still with us, I'd just like to share a few key takeaways for myself, and then we'll conclude. You know, I think we heard really great illustrations of the growing strategic importance of space for African security. Everything for the need for high resolution satellite imagery, to secure communications, to even giving African governments more situational awareness about how their natural resources are being used, from food and water security. So this is why the space industry is booming, and a lot of space-based capabilities have grown more affordable. I think Dr. Zhao mentioned that it's 500 tons is where you get, or 500 pounds is where you get to the point of having a satellite with some serious strategic and military capabilities. That costs approximately $750,000 now. In the near future, that'll be more like $250,000. This is a capability that any government can acquire. What's the problem? I think we heard the key issues are probably less in acquiring some of this technology and more on the legal and capacity building side. I thought Dr. Zhao's kind of concluding points about, you know, the really need for African governments to and space agencies to learn from the best, right? So that they can develop their human and legal and regulatory frameworks to leverage what is a growing industry, all these growing capabilities. That's what's needed right now. That probably more than anything, I think is a huge need that I was not aware of. And you know, finally, I think we talked a lot in this conversation about concerns about autonomy and dependency on various external actors for space-based technology. Unfortunately, I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon. Just the way that the technological space looks like, kind of which powers at the cutting edge. But I think there was a lot of discussion of a potential mitigating factor in enhancing regional cooperation, both in terms of forging common positions on the peaceful uses of outer space, in forging space-based communication, right? You know, Dr. Zhao talked about, for example, avoiding duplication, right? If one African country has a reasonably good communication satellite, another country or region has a good satellite that does imagery of various kinds, there should be protocols in place that enable the sharing of that data that will lessen some of these dependencies. So I would encourage those of you that joined us to think about ways to enhance regional cooperation, to work through you governments and through your RECs and through the AU to do so. And hopefully we will continue this conversation in the months and years going forward. But certainly thanks to all three panelists for what was a really enlightening, really great discussion about the strategic dimensions of space. I think this is clearly a rich and growing topic. I think we achieved our goal of raising awareness among the African security community about the importance of the space domain. So I wish you all a wonderful afternoon and evening. Allow me on behalf of the Africa Center to thank you, Dr. Zhao, you, General Kapkose, and you, Mr. Timidayo, for sharing your wonderful insights with us today. And hopefully, as I said, this is the start of a deeper conversation. Thank you and good evening.